So, you like swords, right? That's one of the main reasons why you're here, if not the only one. And people often ask the question, why did swords become a status symbol? Why were they used or preferred over other weapons that may be more effective in certain situations? And all of that. Now, this topic has been covered by different people a number of times, and I'm sure some of them have done a better job than I will. But either way, I also wanted to give you my take on it and just talk about my thoughts on the matter. So, I don't have a single clear-cut universal answer to that question. As per usual, it depends on a variety of different factors. It depends on where you look, when you look in history, and all that. So, for example, any statements you can make about a sword will not apply to a Viking sword the same way as to this late medieval longsword, because there are a lot of major differences, different purpose, different cultural ideas behind it, different economics even at the time. I think there are many parts to this answer. For example, one thing that people often say is, well, swords were more expensive, so of course they would be more valuable, more of a status symbol, etc. But it really depends on when and where. Europe, late Middle Ages, swords weren't that expensive. I mean, sure, some were extremely expensive, but the cheapest possible sword you could get, or, well, let's just say a long blade, something like this is arguably not quite a sword the same way that an arming sword is, for example, but it can still be used as such. In the late Middle Ages, swords were not restricted to nobility at all. There were plenty of commoners on the battlefield with swords and even plate armor. However, earlier in history, that's absolutely true. In the early Middle Ages, swords were quite expensive to make, and not everybody had them. A lot of Vikings that would go on a raid would just have a spear because it's much more affordable, or even they would just pick up an axe because they couldn't afford anything else. So they used what they could get, and the sword was really reserved for the higher ups. If you look earlier in history, it depends a lot on the location. Romans, for example, common soldiers had a gladius. Officers had a gladius too, and this was not a noble weapon. It was not reserved for the higher classes. But if you look at the Celts, at the same time, to them a sword was much more of a status symbol. Not many Celtic warriors on the battlefield could afford a sword, or even a helmet for that matter, and they quite commonly had spears. If you go far enough back in history, the first tools and weapons that people had in the Stone Age, it was, well, of course, spearheads, and short flint knives, and short blades in general, and of course clubs, stone axes, things like that, and wooden clubs, etc., all of that. And in that case, if you then have something that's a fairly long blade, like the Danish flint daggers, those were very difficult to make. Those required a high level of skill in the art of flint knapping, and they are really amazing, intricate pieces. I've handled a few of them myself, and it's really amazing, especially if you know about how difficult flint knapping is and how much skill it requires. And these are really impressive, and they're very well made, and this is really the top-notch, the highest technology with this kind of material that you can achieve, basically. So state-of-the-art. So I'm pretty sure that those were considered status symbols at the time. Can I prove it? No, there are no written sources from the time. We only have the material culture, so we can make some assumptions based on that. So then later you had bronze, and now you've got a different aspect, something that appeals to basic human nature and aesthetics. Ooh, shiny. It's pretty because it's glistening metal, the way it reflects the sunlight and the way it shines if you polish it. So you've got the aesthetic side, you've got the new technology aspect. You've got the the difficulty in dealing with this new material and also acquiring it. So then you had to get copper and tin, often from different sources that were quite far apart. So it required long distance trade and sophisticated craftsmanship to make something like this, which is very impressive and shiny and everything. Not as much in artificial light as it is in sunlight, but you can still tell that this is quite a nice looking material. So is jewelry and all that, but a blade is a fairly large piece, compared to a lot of other bronze tools, and it requires a substantial amount of material. It requires substantial skill to get it right, to make sure that the blade is not too soft and doesn't bend too easily, and you have to shape the cross section well enough, and all of that. There's a lot that goes into sword making. So of course this was considered a pretty valuable item. And it was even imitated in Scandinavia at the time when other places had entered the Bronze Age. Scandinavia was still in the Stone Age, and they tried to imitate that by making stone blades and attaching them to an organic core, most likely wood. And they tried to get it relatively long. They couldn't with the stone because of the limitation of the material. It would just break, it would shatter if you made such a long blade out of that. So they had to make it in sections. But they still tried. They were still inspired by bronze daggers and swords. Even daggers were often used as a status symbol. Like Tutankhamun has very nice looking daggers, for example. So here you've got the aspect of what is this for? In case of a dagger, it could still be a tool, arguably. If it's essentially a double-edged knife that you can still cut your food with and things like that. A longer blade, not so much. You're not going to cut your sandwich with this. So value is part of it in certain time periods and places. Purpose is part of it, although that depends a little bit. There are things that are a little harder to classify. What is it? Is this a sword? The falx? I'd argue it is a sword, by means of construction and blade length and all of that, having a sharp edge, all of this. But at the same time, this is clearly inspired by an agricultural tool. This is the sword version of a sickle, essentially. And this was, again, not used by nobility. This was used by common soldiers. So it doesn't always apply. In the early Middle Ages, as I said, swords were expensive and valued and were absolutely status symbols. You see that in the sagas of the time, in the myths, in how swords became a symbol of a king or heroes, all of that. So it was a very important symbol, but it was not just about how valuable it is and what it's used for, arguably. There's something else. There's some kind of mythological fascination with it, the magical properties of swords in these stories and all that. So there's something else going on, arguably. Something probably that viscerally appeals to human aesthetics and imagination. Something about the shape, and even something as trivial as the way it glistens in the sunlight. I think that is part of it, as silly as that may sound. Swords also went through a lot of different phases and stages, and they were re-evaluated a number of times in history, going from status symbol to a commoner's weapon, back to a status symbol, and sometimes parallel as well. If you have something like a side sword or a rapier in the Renaissance, this was a civilian self-defense tool. But it was also something that a gentleman would wear, and especially in later times, with the small sword, it eventually became more and more of a fashion item, essentially, where a lot of people started carrying it, wearing it on their person, who weren't trained, who weren't actually fencers and duelists, but just regular gentlemen. who use that as a fashion accessory, which is still the case nowadays. I mean, you have military swords that are not intended for use on modern battlefields. Obviously, uniform sabers and award swords and things like that. That has also always been the case, of course. And as far as the use is concerned, you would think that in certain time periods it would matter more than in others. For example, either a dedicated cutting sword or the kind of thrusting blade that's not intended to be used against armor, like a side sword or a rapier. Now, those were used against unarmored people. Just clothing or light armor, perhaps not plate armor. Even mail is posing a problem for that kind of sword. So if you're likely to encounter armored opponents, even if it's just mail, let alone if it's a full suit of plate armor, then yeah, you need something else. I mean, this, as said, is a sword designed to be used against that. You would, grab it in the center of the blade to have more control over the point, jam it into the eye slit of the visor, under the arms, where there's just mail or nothing. Just exploit the gaps of the armor, the weaknesses. Or alternatively, hold the blade and strike with the guard or pommel, too. But it seems so improvised, compared to using something like this. This is an anti-armor weapon, dedicated anti-armor weapon. There's no doubt about that. You've got the beak here that's supposed to puncture the armor. You've got the hammer. In this case, it's a claw type that's supposed to dig into the armor, give you more purchase to allow you to transfer more force onto the armor, dent it, injure the wearer underneath, limit their mobility, etc. And, spike to try to, again, jab it into the gaps of the armor, things like that. Long handle that can be used for wrestling and things like that. So this is an anti-armor weapon. It's easy to argue for the superiority of the sword in unarmored combat or lightly armored, because cuts with a sword and thrusts cause bleeding, internal bleeding, organ damage. They can sever limbs and all that. They can do a lot of damage, and depending on the type of sword, it can be absolutely gruesome, the kind of injuries that it can cause. At the same time, to argue that a sword is more effective against an unarmored person than this, I used to kind of argue that, but I'm kind of doubting that at this point. Based on the tests I've done, this is devastating. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter if you're armored or not. This is still an absolutely vicious weapon. Does that have something to do with it? Perhaps. The status of the sword. It doesn't seem as brutish as something like this, in direct comparison, even though a sword can lop off limbs, and did on historical battlefields and in duels. It still doesn't seem quite as brutish as something like this, as savage and vicious as a spiked club or mace. So I'm sure this is not the most satisfying answer. I was basically rambling all over the place and talking about so many different aspects of it, but I think that's the reality of it. It's a multifaceted topic. There are so many different things you can consider, in different time periods and different cultures and different types of sword compared to certain other types of weapons, and different materials and uses, and there's so much to it. But, ultimately I do think that the sort of visceral aesthetic appeal of a sword has a lot to do with it. I don't think we should discard that. I think this may really be one of the main parts of why swords were so popular and why they were status symbols. They tend to look more elegant or more sophisticated, and they can be, highly decorated and all of that. There's a lot about it that just gives you that wow effect, essentially. And even that is a limited one-sided answer, because there are plenty of beautiful, sophisticated, decorated, aesthetically pleasing polearms. You know, especially if you look at Chinese stuff like this, there's a lot that looks just as awe-inspiring and jaw-dropping as the finest sword. So yeah, a lot of different reasons, and again, there's no simple answer, but I just felt like talking about this because it's an interesting topic, and there's a lot that we can share and discuss. And anyway, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Check out the video description below. I'll leave a link to my favorite online store for buying swords, and also a few other things like, you know, my Twitch account. I've now started streaming regularly, and Patreon, and all of that. Anyway, I hope you have a good day, and thanks.